Welcome to Talking Books, a podcast about the most important books of the day from the people who bring you Talking Feds. I'm Harry Littman. In January 2018, Jason Kander, a 36-year-old veteran of the war in Afghanistan who recently had mounted an exciting, if narrowly unsuccessful, Missouri Senate race against incumbent Roy Blount, was on the short list of many people, including former President Obama, for a Democratic run for president in 2020. 7 months later, having set his sights substantially lower with the candidacy for Kansas City mayor, he dropped out of that campaign and revealed that he had been suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Today, he's substantially well and serving as the president of a nonprofit organization that serves homeless and at-risk veterans. Underneath that trajectory lies quite a story, and in a memoir that has just been published entitled Invisible Storm, Kander has presented it in a clear-eyed, unflinching, and yet unpretentious manner. We're really pleased to welcome Jason Kander to discuss Invisible Storm. Jason, thank you very much for being with us on Talking Books.
Thank you, Harry, for having me. I really appreciate it. Thanks for that nice introduction.
So let's start, speaking of nice introductions, with the sit-down with one 44th President of the United States, Barack Obama, who summons you in 2018 after your Senate run, which in the book you say you sort of win by losing. So you're by all accounts a serious candidate for a cabinet position. You're really considered to be on a short list for president. It must have been very heady for a relatively young man whose highest office had been Missouri Secretary of State, yeah?
Yeah, it was heady, but also, interestingly, throughout this whole time while I'm having these symptoms of post-traumatic stress that are bedeviling me, and I'm not admitting to myself that it's post-traumatic stress, I'm having stuff like night terrors, I'm having hypervigilance or paranoia and, anger issues and self-loathing, and it's building into depression. The one thing that interestingly never flagged, and maybe this is a credit to my parents, or I don't know what this is, was my confidence in my abilities as a politician. Like I had real doubts about myself as a human the whole way, but for whatever reason, while it was surreal to sit there with President Obama and have him tell me that he thought, that I was one of the people who should really look at this and do it. That was wild because he was my political hero and, like the most famous person on the planet as well, I guess. There's that, but it was also like there's a big part of me that is hard to explain that was like, yeah, this makes sense. Like, and I don't know what that is.
It's clear in the book. I mean, you say in a very sober, clear-eyed way, and it's one of the many impressive qualities of the book. You don't shy away from touting the abilities that you always maintain, but you said, you were probably the best person to take on Trump. Even where you're starting from. Well, actually, just let me ask you, what was your thought process there? It seems plausible we're hearing now, and maybe we'll end here, the kind of crisis of youth and the lack of a bench for the Dems, and wind up with a really old candidate. There's a little bit of a crisis now. What were you thinking in 2018 that made it, in a bizarre way, kind of natural that Obama would be saying this to you? And I'll just add one thing, which is it's a great conversation in the book. It's a good place. I totally recommend the book to everybody. But Obama goes through the whole thing. Here's what Klobuchar has. Here's what Biden has. But you, Kander, you're a natural. You have what I had. You had this, impalpable quality that it when you see it, and it's in some ways the greatest compliment one could receive.
Yeah. Well, one thing I want to make clear, just in case people don't read the book, in President Obama's defense, I don't quote him as naming anybody else and comparing directly.
Right. He goes through the candidates, though.
I did. Yeah, I did. I just said, well, he went through all the advantages everybody else had that I didn't have.
Right.
And I that's just me, Harry, being self-conscious about the fact that like I quoted a private conversation, even though I quoted one line out of an hour and a half, but still, it's still like, because I respect the man so much, it's still
he put you on the list. He put you on the list.
Yeah. And And so anyway, I guess at the time, to understand what I was thinking, it's got to be sort of wrapped up in the context of the proclivity of people who I know this now, of people who are trauma survivors to seek some sort of self-medication through redemption, which is part of what I think I was doing. Now, part of it was I genuinely believed that I had the abilities to be the best person to unseat the worst person to ever be president. But I also, part of what drove me as soon as I came back from Afghanistan and when I went, campaigned for the state house, campaigned for Secretary of State, for Senate, and eventually for president, and then for like 5 minutes for mayor, there was part of me that was pushing me so hard that was like, you haven't done enough. You have to make yourself whole by going and doing this. And I think it was almost like any doubts that I would have had about my abilities would have been filled in by a feeling of, well, it doesn't matter. I don't have a choice. Like, I didn't do enough for my country.
Really?
I didn't do enough compared to the other people who got hurt, the people who I knew, who, I trained with, who got hurt, that kind of thing. It was like, I had to save the world or I wasn't going to be happy. But what I didn't understand was if I'd somehow saved the world, I still wasn't going to be happy.
Yeah.
I just needed to treat myself.
All right. So having put you started on the top of Mount Olympus, let's crawl all the way down, and it was crawling. So I want to we'll come back here, but after a detour to the seeds of your PTSD, namely your service to the country in Afghanistan. So first, let me ask you about that initial decision. Part of you, I mean, you do say candidly that a lot of politicians, and you were thinking of being a politician from a young age, like to think of military as an important mark to check. But you also describe you're in first year law school. You and Diana, your wife, she's kind of taking to it, and you're a little bit. And from the moment you go into ROTC, there is this sense of exhilaration and purpose. So I just wanted to ask you, what was the military for you? Maybe this comes from your dad and grandfather. And what was it? What were the mix of motivations that made you go there at a time when, it's not a normal move, even for people with political ambitions, to go into ROTC?
Yeah. I do reference the idea in the book that I had a vague idea of the military as like a resume enhancer. And that was, maybe 15% of what was driving me there. Right. But really it was just that I came from this background where I grew up with a lot of privilege, and, my parents had been juvenile probation officers. My dad had been a cop, but like my family was, wealthy. Like, we had done well, we were comfortable. And I had had this example from my parents of you take care of people. If you have the means to do it, you protect other people. And, like a lot of other folks, I didn't come from a military family, but my grandfather and my great grandfather and my great uncle, when there was a war, they went, and then they went on with their lives afterwards. And to me, that just, for whatever reason, that made a lot of sense to me. And before 9/11, I would say often to my fiance at the time, now wife, that, I had never been tested, and that I just didn't feel like a real man if I'd never been tested. And I had this idea in my mind at the age of 20, 21, that there was some great test out there for me, maybe. And then 9/11 happened, and it was like the vague notion of maybe serving in the reserves one day as like a lawyer or something became, no, I'm going to go in right now, and I'm going to find a job that makes sense for me to be able to make a contribution to this war effort, and then I'll go back to my life. So I became an Army intelligence officer. And what was really important to me in the book was a couple of things in this regard.
I wanted to ask you about your duties in Afghanistan, which turn out to carry the seeds of real anguish down the line. It sounded pretty cool as you described it. Tell us, please, what your basic job entailed there. And then, if you like, there are a couple really rough things that happened to you that you didn't remember it at the time. Maybe you can fold that in as well to set up also the difficulties that await you after you return.
Sure. So when I was putting the book together, I wanted to make sure that I did a couple of things for people with regard to my deployment. One, I needed people who probably weren't inclined to serve in the military or never did to understand why I loved it so much. So I
Yeah.
had to like gradually tell them how I came to fall in love with it. And I needed
Not
to
not a
tell them,
normal concept, right? People have this view of it being totally miserable, and you
right.
actually made it sound kind of cool. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and right, and it was something that meant a lot to me and was a big part of what I liked about myself. And then the other part that I needed to explain was what I did over there. But what I didn't want to do was write a book that would turn. I wanted to write a mental health memoir, so I didn't want to turn people off who don't read books about the military or don't read books about politics or don't read books that are like, historical fiction about war and that kind of thing. The kind of stuff that's on like my dad's bookshelf, right? Like I wanted to write something that was for everybody. So the first chapter is me going into the military so you can understand how I came to fall in love with it through my own eyes. And then the second chapter is Afghanistan. But I didn't want to just like try and cover my entire deployment in one chapter. So what I did is I just took one day that I happen to remember very well because the weather was really good that day. And I just kind of offered it as a typical day. And on that typical day that I offered, it was a day where, as an intelligence officer, I, for instance, had a meeting with a guy who I didn't know what his allegiances were, and I kind of lay out what it was like to go into these meetings and to know where all the exits are and to know where the vulnerabilities are. But then also the work we did the rest of that day, where we were basically pulling security while a bunch of Afghan army recruits were taking a basic written test and learning how to do push-ups, but we were completely outnumbered if anybody chose to ambush us. And
Which
people
could,
can,
right? You're meeting with people all the time who maybe they're on your side, maybe they're on two different sides, maybe they're running drugs, maybe that it would be convenient to shoot you, and you at least describe one meeting where you have to put your back to the door just as a sign of trust and respect, but it means you get, to put a finer point on it, it's something you never do now, or when you came back, it was a sign of where you'd been, that you could never let yourself do that in the States.
yeah, like so. Where I needed to take the reader was a place where they could understand in a relatively short period of time how I got to a point where, without having to fire my weapon for my entire deployment, I still came home unable to turn my back to the door, unable to sleep through the night, that kind of thing. Because I went 11 years not understanding how those two things were connected and trying to convince myself that because I hadn't fired my weapon, I therefore was not a combat veteran. And it, took a clinical social worker at the VA to convince me of that. But so that's why, at least like I'd say 80% of the book is what comes after Afghanistan. And just seeing what it's like for me to deal with this untreated and undiagnosed psychological disorder while, pursuing the presidency, your standard coming of age tale. So,
Exactly. Well, yeah, I mean, you have a great description in the book that as a result of Afghanistan, while there, but even after coming home, you having learned what it feels like to believe, at least, you may be killed violently, every single threat, and I guess this included an opponent gaining, a point and a half in a certain precinct, would, as you put it, ring the bell at the top of the threat meter. But I really want to bear down on this a little bit more, though, because there you talk about your pre-Afghanistan life and your political ambition, and was very curious as reading the book whether that was at least a component. So let me serve it up with this question. Had you never, I don't know if you've thought about it, or really even, I'm sure you've thought about it, but I don't know if you have a definitive answer for yourself. Had you never gone to Afghanistan, Jason, do you think nothing like this would have happened to you?
you mean in terms of my mental health?
Yeah.
Um, Look, I think that a lot more Americans and people in general have trauma than we realize.
Yeah.
And uh, and so I think that while this book is going to help, and I know has already helped because I've sent it to several fellow combat veterans,
Yeah.
I also believe it's going to help. And again, I've sent it to a few, and I know it will. People who have just had trauma, and I think the stats are something like 1 in 5 people will experience some kind of trauma in their life, and like 8% will have PTSD. And I think that those are super, super low.
Yeah.
I think at some point, everybody experiences some kind of trauma in their life. Maybe it's surviving cancer. Maybe it's a bad car accident. Maybe it's losing a loved one, or something that happens in their childhood. A bad divorce. Like there are trauma of different kinds that we have in our lives. So look, would I have possibly ended up with some sort of trauma, and as a result needed to get help? Probably. I think the unique thing about my situation was, my trauma came from being a combat veteran, but that's not even the most unique part, because that's not that unique, sadly, anymore. What's unique about it is that when I came home, if this book had existed, and that's why I wrote this book, and I had read it, I think I would have gone to get treatment. And as a result, at that point, things weren't that bad as far as where my mental health had gone, right? I mean, and that's one of the things you see in the book is my symptoms get worse and worse over time, because trauma is not like wine. It's the opposite. It doesn't get better with time. And so had I done that all those years ago, it would not have gotten as bad as it did. And so that's really at the heart of what happened to me, is the telling myself for years that this couldn't be trauma, because I was discounting my own service and didn't believe that it could result in that.
Got it. And look, I'm really interested in this, not specifically about you, Jason, but about your, people in politics or uber alpha folks. Because even before, like, you clearly were a natural, as the President Obama recognized. But did I read it correctly that certain things that you came to combat, as it were, after going to the VA, predated Afghanistan? I'm thinking in particular, you write that you always conjoined your extreme natural abilities, and anyone who hasn't ever seen the 30-second Jason Kander rifle commercial that shot you to national prominence ought to see it. And it's not just because it's such a brilliant idea, but you're so self possessed and winning in it. But you write that you always had a sort of lack of joy in the moment, and a sort of anger fueling you, even though you seemed like the chillest guy ever. Do I read that correctly? And do those elements, in fact, uh, predate Afghanistan?
I feel like what predated Afghanistan was a drive for accomplishment, and I was really possessed with a drive to feel that I was part of something really important. I think those things were there. And so I think as a result, like I would have been a very competitive, very driven person regardless. I would have been interested, I think, in public service regardless. And so there was maybe an element of that. But what happened with the military, or more specifically with Afghanistan for me, is it took all of that, and it took all of the nuance and positive emotions that I had with all of that, and it basically wiped all of that away. So as a result, I was somebody, I think, pre-Afghanistan, that had I, run for an office and come up short. Well, first of all, I would have run for an office. I would have thrown myself into it, but I don't think I would have thrown myself into it in a way where I did, say, with my first campaign, where I lost like 15 pounds. And I think I would have had I think I would have had a healthier approach. Now, I would have won by less, but I would have had, or maybe not won, but I would have been still able to find other things in my life, other pursuits that I could enjoy. And one of those things would have been my family, which ultimately what it turned out, because Afghanistan had stripped away from me all of those other emotions that weren't useful in a combat zone, and that I came home still thinking I shouldn't use. It made it where I couldn't enjoy those other parts of life, including my family. And that's what I had to deal with.
Just one follow-up. You've been up close to a lot of ambitious people, not necessarily very talented. I don't mean this in a jaundiced way, but I think, you saw yourself as much more public minded and driven to do good than many of your colleagues when you're first elected to state office. Do you think that many politicians, in fact, live, and we may wind up cutting this out, but do you think that many politicians do live lives of sort of quiet desperation where they're just stuck on an ambition treadmill? They're not happy, but they don't have the wherewithal or imagination to get the hell out.
Yes.
All
And
right. In a
don't
word,
cut it
yeah.
out.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. Now, I don't think that all politicians do. I don't think that most do necessarily. But do I think that at a greater rate than, say, like, I don't know, like accountants?
Potters.
Yeah. Then
Yeah.
yes. I mean, but I would actually put it a little beyond just politicians. And the way I would do this is I would put politicians into a larger category for context, because, look, what is politics at the end of the day? Yes, it's public service. Yes, it's about trying to make the world a better place. But it is also, as people have said in the past, show business for ugly people, which is to say, as politicians, we are, among many other things, performers. And so when I look at people who perform for a living, whether they be actors or musicians or stand-up comedians or anybody who that's their job, they to some degree journalists, like broadcast journalists, anybody who has an audience, a constituency, and particularly people who have the opportunity to get up and feel that energy of being in front of other people. Yes, I don't think it's a particularly controversial thing to say that there is sometimes. So, sometimes it's natural. Sometimes it's just, hey, I'm good at this and I like doing it. That's where I think I have arrived at this point in my life. And I'm always sort of checking that for myself for when I do things like this. This is performing. This, writing a book is and all that. I think that I'm doing it because I enjoy it and because it offers value to others. But there's no question that part of me just really likes it, right? And there's that sort of feedback, particularly in the day and age we live in now, that nearly instant feedback that you get from others. But yeah, I think that there's a piece of that for a lot of politicians, and I don't want to name names, but I can think of people, and I don't think it's hard for people to figure out who I'm thinking about. They're not all people I disagree with. Some are people I agree with. It's not to say there's something bad about them in that respect, but that maybe they would be
There's nothing bad about
better
any
at what
of
they're
this,
doing.
right? I mean, that's part of the lesson. Yeah.
If you deal with your stuff, you're better off in a leadership role. There's no question.
Yeah. And by the way, this is too compelling a story, so we didn't take these detours. But for listeners, speaking of performers, during these heady days for Jason, there's a great story of Jason Sudeikis, a fellow Kansas City, and meeting him and other kind of high wire performers, and also a lot of little candid points about what drives politicians or what's cool about being a politician that you'll have to read the book to get to, but I recommend it. All right, so let's go to in some ways the dramatic climax of the book. This moment of realization, you were all the way in the way up on Olympus thinking about the cabinet or running for president. Something obviously clicked, and you way downsized to mayor of Kansas City, a position that you could have waltzed into. And then it's like, no, there's a moment of realization that you described. So I wanted to ask you to describe it, and also ask you, in retrospect, as you sit here today, do you think it was sort of the first time, or did you have inklings before, or did Diana or whatever, your wife, that maybe for all the rewards and all the attention, this is the costs are too great?
I knew that this was bad for me because I knew something was wrong with me.
You knew it before your big moment of realization, you're saying?
Yes. Yeah. I had known for a few years at that point that most of the other people, for instance, looking at running for president, weren't stalking their house at night with either a pistol or a hammer, thinking that there was an intruder, or absolutely believing someone was trying to kidnap their son, or that their wife was in danger all the time, and that they were probably sleeping through the night without violent night terrors and that kind of stuff. I was aware of that. What I refused to admit to myself was that it was PTSD and that it was related to my service, because the story I was telling myself was the same story that the military had told me, which is, and it's the same thing they tell everybody, because you have to get us to do hard jobs, which is, hey, what you're doing is no big deal. You just go do it. It's not that big of a deal. Other people have it much worse. And nobody disabused me of that notion when I left the military. So that's what I believed. So after a while, I just thought, well, I'm really good at this. I'm resigned to probably a short life of consequence. And I'm basically outside myself, watching myself experience it and not getting to experience any of this stuff, including not really feeling like I was experiencing good times with my family. And so what I was doing was, to your point, when I was like kind of at the zenith of my political career, is I was piecing together, like any other addict, endorphin highs from performing or from, getting a great article or a great interview or a big speech that everybody noticed, or sitting down with, the former president and having him tell me it's not a crazy idea for me to run for president. That kind of stuff was giving me endorphin highs that would then last long enough to get me to the next endorphin high. So I got on a plane and I didn't get off, 46 states in a year, 300 flights, speeches all over the place. And it all builds to me keynoting the biggest night in Democratic politics in New Hampshire, where the year before me, the keynote was, I think, Hillary Clinton, and the year after me, it was Elizabeth Warren. And it was this room full of people who, were the people that you basically tell you're going to run for president to. And it was on national television. My parents were watching it at home. And it was a big moment, big speech. And I don't nail all the speeches I give in my life, but I nailed that one. And I knew I did. And,
I mean, you describe it, look, and it's just accurate for anyone who follows politics even glancingly. You hit it the fuck out of the park. It was like it was just a 450 straight drive to center, right?
Thanks.
I say that as a former baseball journalist, but you were the real deal and now a great Royals fan. But, you clobbered the speech.
Yeah. And you can feel it when you do. You can feel it in the room. I knew that I did. And then I felt amazing that night, felt amazing the next morning. I'm getting on the plane. The TSA guy checks my ID and says, oh, next president of the United States. So everything's feeling great. Yeah. And typically these sort of endorphin highs last a few days. And I get on the plane and, I'm not 12 hours past this biggest moment of my political life. And I didn't feel a thing. I suddenly was as empty as I had been the day after I had lost the election for Senate. And that's when I knew, okay, something is seriously wrong. I wasn't able to admit to myself at that point that it was PTSD, but I knew something was wrong. And a few days later, I decide with my wife that I'm going to do two things. I'm going to go to the VA. I wasn't ready to say it was PTSD, but I was like, maybe I can go to the VA and figure out what's going on with me. But then the other thing, this brilliant plan I came up with was, instead of running for president, I'm going to run for mayor of my hometown, which I love. My kids are sixth generation Kansas Cityans. And I thought, well, serving my neighbors in my hometown, that's what I need. That will give me the sense of purpose I need. So I didn't keep my promise to myself about going to the VA, but I did start running for mayor. It was going very well. We were going to win. But I started to get worse faster than I had been getting worse. I'd been getting worse for years, but it was now feeling like I was getting worse faster. And this campaign around me was going great. I should have been really enjoying it. I mean, I was, the front runner for mayor by a long shot in my hometown that I love. And it should have been really fun, but I was increasingly thinking about killing myself. And because I now had that my symptoms
literally,
had gotten
right?
to the point
You had
of
suicidal ideation, as the doctors would say.
Yeah. And that scared me because the way I put it in the book is I didn't want to die. And, about 3 months into the campaign for mayor, I remember thinking, I got to try something else. So I called the VA Veteran Crisis Line. And I remember thinking, well,
I want to stop you because this is, I have some questions just about this. Let me just break it down a little. I thought it was a fascinating choice that you were going to go and went to the VA. You describe it in detail, and some of it's hilarious. There's this one point where you explain it's germane in your treatment to explain that you'd been talking to Obama, and the intake person says, "And how long have you been hearing voices?" But I mean, for someone of your profile, which is prominent nationally, but is uber prominent in Kansas City, You obviously could have gone to a well-heeled private clinic. And in fact, you had to go through kind of the whole bureaucratic hassles and wait for treatment for several months. You just walked in to the dreary, drab downtown government building. Did you? What made you do it that way? And did you give it a thought of doing something that would be less visible?
There were a couple of things. One, my very close friend, who is a Marine, who I write about a little in the book, Stephen, had gotten his own version of help,
Yeah.
and I had seen him utilize the VA, and I had seen that over the last couple of years, and he had really mentored me, and he really mentored me a lot through the beginning of my treatment. He eventually would, but so that was part of it, is that I knew he had had success with that. But the other thing was, I understood at least enough to know that the VA had been dealing with, like, by the time I made that call to the Veterans Crisis Line and I heard that woman on the other end of the line speak to me in a tone of voice about my suicidal ideation that I'd never mentioned to anybody in my life other than Diana, speak to me about my service in a way that was so normal, and she was so unfazed by it, that I realized, oh, I sound to her like every other vet she has talked to, and that's when I realized I am like every other vet she has talked to. And I stopped distinguishing myself from everyone else. I knew that I wanted to go to the VA because I wanted to sit with someone who this is what they did, and who I knew I would never say anything and they would go, well, that's weird, I don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I found, was that, the PTSD clinic in Kansas City, at the VA, my therapist, Nick, who I write about a lot in the book,
Yeah.
there was never a moment where I explained something and he was like, oh, I've never heard that before, ever. Like, he just would like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Let me draw up on the whiteboard why your brain is doing that.
Yeah.
And that's what I wanted. And that's what I got. You're right, though. It was a difficult process initially to get into the VA. And that's why I had to turn to Veterans Community Project for help. But once I was there, everybody, and this is still true, I still get treatment there for everything, including like my primary care. Everybody I have dealt with, particularly every clinician, has just been amazing.
I see all that, and power to you, but I can imagine some steward of your career. Is it who was the guy who was with you from the start? Is it Arnie or no?
Stephen? Oh,
St-
Abe.
Abe, sorry, who would have said, okay, fine, do it that way, but go through the back door and place a call high. But you really went like
Well, by that time I already knew I was so messed up that
Yeah.
I knew, like, the next day I was dropping out of everything, and I had already
Yeah.
written the letter for it. So it was
Yeah.
like, well, let's go get this started.
And I just want to depart for a few minutes for a few seconds, maybe, from my journalistic role here, and just say, I mean, no, you wrote the letter, you did this interview with Lester Holt. I thought it was an unbelievably courageous and compassionate, empathetic move to other suffering people. And, knowing the depths of the issue just made it more admirable, the help and hope you gave to so many, and the sheer guts of A, stepping away, and B, telling America what you were doing. I just want to say, power to you, Jason
thank you.
Kander. It's so deeply admirable. All right,
Thank
so
you.
now back to hard guy journalist. What are you
Okay.
doing with your hair? What's the problem there? Yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the therapy. Because you mentioned it's not, we sometimes read accounts of people who get PTSD and go off the rails and have tragic ends. You knew a couple such people. And then maybe we have after school movies where, people suddenly, everything gets gauzy and they're back with their child and spouse, etc. You portray it very sort of clear-eyed. It's a sort of two-step forward, one-step back process. There's a point, great point in the book where you tell, I think it's to Diana, it's a pretty bad day, but I can see how tomorrow will be better. I mean, just the sort of sense of hope being kindled. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the treatment about, is it hard one foot after another? Were there times where you thought this isn't working? Just describe that period in your life.
It was very hard. It was, when I first started therapy, my great uncle said to me, it was great advice. He said, getting therapy is like getting a master's degree in yourself. And that's what it was. It was like going to a very difficult graduate school, complete with all the homework. And because I would go into the sessions and, there was work to do with my therapist in the sessions. And a lot of it was, unpleasant, right? Because it was like prolonged exposure therapy in some cases, which is where I have to talk about the memories that were disruptive to me and that were, traumatic memories and experiences. And then in between, I had to listen to those. And I had to listen to them without distraction and get to the point where they didn't have a grip on me, where they didn't bother me so much. But then I also had to go do things like go sit in a restaurant with my back to the door for 45 minutes or go on a walk, without looking behind me over and over again. And
because Nick told you to.
Yeah,
this was assigned. Yeah,
that was the kind of thing that was my homework, and so it was difficult. And the reason. So basically the whole third act of the book, right, is after I've stepped away from everything, and now I have this new battle, this new mountain to climb, which is getting to a place of post-traumatic growth. And to be real honest with you, Harry, that's the book I wanted to write, and I really wanted to write a long article about it, but I was persuaded by a lot of people.
Publisher.
Yeah, well, and a lot of people that like, hey. People aren't going to read that book if you don't tell them the story of how you got there, because it's a pretty original story. And so I said, okay. So I told a very raw, not always well reflecting on me story that got me to that place. Totally. And then that gives me the license to now tell the reader to take them inside the therapy sessions and tell them what it's like. And the reason I wanted to do that is because of what you mentioned, which is that there are so many depictions of what I refer to as PTSD porn in our lives. Oftentimes combat veterans, but not always, who are beating their spouse or robbing a bank or abusing drugs or whatever. But what we almost never see is depictions of what is actually quite common, it turns out, which is people who have been through treatment and then as a result have achieved post-traumatic growth. And I knew that I had done a lot of good by coming out and saying I was going to go get help and that it helped a lot of people be seen. But I knew that now I could do a lot more good if I could show people that it's not insurmountable. Here's what it's like to do it, so that it doesn't feel like what I thought it was for so many years, which was that PTSD was a terminal diagnosis from a life or career perspective. I wanted to show, no, you can go and you can treat this like any other injury, and then you can go on with your life in exactly the way you want to do it.
Do you ever muse or ruminate about, what if you hadn't made the decision or hadn't come out, etc.? You seemed so not just comfortable with the decision, but so happy about it. It was so, life-saving. It seems to be the view, yeah?
Yeah, that's why it doesn't take much ruminating, right? Because like people say to me sometimes, they'll, because my Senate race, I came within 3 points of winning on a day when in my state, Hillary Clinton lost by 19, right? Yes. And so people are always like asking me, well, what if the Comey letter hadn't happened? What if I'm just like, well, then I probably would have won. And they're like, well, then what would have happened? And I go, well, I probably would have killed myself because I don't think I would have ever gone to get treatment.
Laugh, but yes, exactly.
No, it's okay. It's like, it's so simple for me. Like people are shocked when I say like, I'm glad I didn't win that race. And I'm like, yep, because I wouldn't probably be here. I would not have gone to get help. I wouldn't have done those things. I don't think I may have, but I don't think I would have. And so the other piece to it is that people are sometimes shocked that I'm not just like itching to get back into running for office. And I think often they think it's because of my mental health. And what they don't understand is that they're right, but not for the reason they think. It's because I'm now quite mentally healthy and I'm enjoying my life. And going into politics wouldn't harm that necessarily. Going like running for office again wouldn't harm that necessarily because I feel I'm in politics. But it's more like, well, now I'm able to make a choice in a really clear-minded way, and I love my job, and I like coaching Little League, and I like playing on a men's baseball team, not softball, but real baseball. Yeah. And I got 2 kids and a wife I love, and like my life is exactly where I want it to be. And I don't need to think about what I'll do in the future because I'm enjoying the present.
Yeah. Um, again, just power to you. And yeah, it just sounds like you have two kids, True and Bella. And well, I want to talk about Diana in a second. Let me just, I was going to ask you about your life today, but you pretty well summarized it. Just talk briefly, because you do serve as president of national expansion at VCP. Tell us a little bit about that organization and what you do with it.
So 6 weeks before I dropped out of public life, as part of the mayoral campaign, I toured Veterans Community Project in Kansas City. And Veterans Community Project is this really inspiring place that basically does two things. It has an outreach operation that focuses on serving any and all veteran with anything they need, which is squarely in the space of dealing with the suicide epidemic among veterans. And then the second thing they do, which we do now, which is much better known for, is dealing with veterans' homelessness by building villages of tiny houses with wraparound case management services to basically restart the military to civilian transition back at day one for homeless veterans. And it does this with an enormously outsized success rate. And so I toured it, and as a politician, I've toured a lot of nonprofits. Yeah. And it's always impressive. But this one, it just felt like home. It was like a forward operating base in Afghanistan and a startup in Silicon Valley had a baby. Like, it just was incredible to me. And I went home that night and I said to Diana, I wish I could quit everything I'm doing and just go work there. But it wasn't a realistic notion. I was running for office again, and I went back to doing that the next day. But 6 weeks later, when I found myself in the suicide hold room at the emergency department at the VA in Kansas City. And I was being told during that visit that it was probably going to be 4 or 5 months before I could get enrolled in the VA and start weekly therapy. I wasn't sure what to do. So that day when I got home, I called Brian Meyer, one of the co-founders of Veterans Community Project, and I told him, hey, I'm making this big announcement tomorrow, and the VA is telling me I can't even go there yet. And he's like, why don't you come down here? So 6 weeks after that VIP You're Going to Be Mayor tour, I walked through the front doors of the outreach center like thousands of other Kansas City vets. They expedite my paperwork, handle it for me. And a week later, I have my first therapy appointment at the VA. And so I became a big believer in it. And then as I start to improve a lot personally through therapy over the months that followed, I started to hang out at VCP. And communities all across the country were looking at what Kansas City had done and saying, hey, can you bring it here? And they were not exactly sure how to do it. And I had created a national organization. So I came on board 3 years ago.
Let's Vote America, right early on, yeah.
Yeah. Let America Vote. I created that with Abe and with Kellen, who Kellen I then dragged into Veterans Community Project with me to handle the fundraising. And now, we're in Sioux Falls, we're in Denver, we're in St. Louis, we're in Oklahoma City, we're going to other places. And it's the best civilian job I've ever had. And that's why all of my royalties from this book are actually going toward Veterans Community Project's fight against veteran suicide and veteran homelessness.
All right. Now, you mentioned before that a lot of people, more than they recognize, way more than society recognizes, get PTSD. And one of them, you mentioned in the book, is your wife, Diana, has the trauma kind of maybe secondhand through you. It was an interesting choice. For listeners, there are maybe 15 different passages from Diana. They read a little bit like contemporaneous accounts from a diary, but they're very much in her own voice rather than your just portraying it yourself. I wanted to ask you about that choice as an author to include passages from her and what role they play for you in the book.
Yeah. I don't usually read memoirs, particularly memoirs by politicians, because they're boring. And they're like, basically like, here is a perfectly packaged version of my experience that will make you like me quite a lot, right? And I thought one of the ways to break that up is to have the perspective of somebody else come in. The other way is, of course, that I wrote a book where like I often don't come off that well. So that pretty well accomplished that.
Look, it was hard. It was hard on your marriage, right? Obviously.
Right. Yeah. And I wanted people to see a few things. I wanted people to see how trauma and how mental health challenges can affect a marriage and how a marriage can weather it and how difficult that is. I also wanted people who maybe hadn't experienced combat, which will be a lot of the people who read this book, I hope, people who hadn't experienced trauma necessarily, or mental health challenges to be able to have a narrator that they could really relate to. Because if you don't have any of that, you can relate to me in the book because I gradually get you there with me in the story. But I wanted them to also have somebody who they could connect with about living with somebody who was going through this, because that's a really important takeaway from the book, is what it's like to live with somebody who's going through this, how to be there for them. And finally, as you mentioned, I wanted people to know what she and I did not know when I started therapy, which is that, secondary post-traumatic stress is a thing and it has to be dealt with. And so that's why periodically throughout the book, Diana comes in the first person with what she refers to jokingly as her rebuttals. Because, there are parts where I'm describing things from my point of view, and then she'll come in and be like, yeah, that didn't make any sense. Yeah. And so I think my favorite thing about the book is that, yes, it's a story about mental health. Yes, it's to some extent a story about politics, about, the military or combat and all those things. But more than anything, it's a love story is what it is. And it's about two people surviving this thing together and coming out the other side much better for it.
It seems like you still do have a place at the table for discussions with national leaders. The Democratic Party seems to be facing quite a tough spot in the midterms, be in general crisis. Do you have a sense of what the party needs to do and whether or not you play a personal role in it? How would you advise your party to try to, dust itself off and get out of the problems that the country is in?
Well, I do feel I play a personal role in it. I'm just not putting my name on a ballot, right? But I have my podcast, Majority 54, where we talk about, this very question. I am, as you pointed out, pretty close to a lot of the people leading the party and therefore the country. And so, I have these conversations on a regular basis, and I do occasionally do things that I think qualify as activism. I'm still on political boards and that kind of thing. And look, I'm really worried about the midterms. I don't want to mislead you. We're not in a good spot. And what I don't have some silver bullet solution, but what I will tell you is that as somebody who lives here in the very middle of the country, surrounded by some people who agree with me, some people who don't, and having friends of both of those types, I'll tell you that we really underestimate our ability to take what we stand for and make it resonate here. And what I mean by that is there's this really false choice that's been being batted back and forth, particularly on cable news in the last few years, which is that the Democratic Party has to somehow choose a course that is on some policy spectrum on the left, that it's either you're very moderate or you're very progressive, and that's the key to winning people over. Well, that's really not true. The key to winning people over is just a matter of whether you are a little bit progressive or a lot bit progressive, understanding that you have to talk about how that affects people's lives. It's not a matter of Trump didn't show up in 2016 in the Midwest and start talking about trade deals, and everybody was looking at a spreadsheet of different trade deals and how it had affected their life. And voters were like, well, he makes a lot of sense on NAFTA because no, that's not what happened. What happened is the rhetoric he was using, whether he knew it or not, was saying to people that your kids are not going to have to leave where you live, and you're not going to have to leave where you live in order for you to be successful. And that means you're going to get to be near your grandkids without having to leave your friends. And that is whether you're talking about inflation or, everything, violence, guns, healthcare, all of it, minimum wage, all of these issues are being able to afford college. What they really come down to is the big blind spot, I think, from our party, which shouldn't be a blind spot because we're better on this issue. And that is that everybody wants their family to be nearby. And my kids are 8 and 1, and I still think all the time already about what's going to happen when it's time for them to go to college, or even more than that, when it's time for them to decide what they're going to do for a living, where they're going to do that. They're 6th generation Kansas Cityans. I would love it if they raised 7th generation Kansas Cityans. But look, the truth is if they don't, and if they're in the same place, I'm probably going to follow them. And that's because I have the ability to do that and the means to do that. But all my friends and my family are here. I don't want to do that. And nobody wants to do that. People care about their home. And that's what we need to do a better job of talking about, is that the things we believe in and the things that we want to do make it more likely that you and your family can be close to one another and prosperous and safe and healthy at the same time.
The book is Invisible Storm. The author is Jason Kander. Among other things, which we haven't mentioned, and a point of overlap with his political idol, Barack Obama, it's a really good read and extremely well written. Anyway, thank you very much, Jason, for writing it, and thanks very much for talking to us about it on Talking Books.
Thank you, Harry, for having me. I really appreciate it.